Hey everybody, I'm Tracker from South Florida Insider, and today I'm with Sean Stone. He's a producer on The Paradigm of Money, which we're going to be talking about today. Hey Sean, how are you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Well, I mentioned before, I just watched the film and it was really good. But could you give a brief, just rundown of how you got involved into this project?
Sure, sure. So I've done quite a few documentaries over the years, and I've also worked with Peter Antico. He helped produce a film that we made a few years ago called The Fury of the Fist and the Golden Fleece, which was like a send-up martial arts comedy that was quite fun with a whole cast of iconic actors like Danny Trejo and Michael Dudikoff and Don the Dragon Wilson and so many people that showed up for that film. So Pete and I have known each other for a long time. He's got a background in stunts, but he's also quite savvy when it comes to sort of how the financial systems work to a sense, not from being an insider himself, but just having studied it. I think, he's savvy, he gets it. And so he always wanted to do this documentary about Wall Street corruption and the nature of fiat currency, you could call it, right? That which is not tied once we've divorced from our dollar from the gold standard. It's really become sort of fiat. So he's very much had an issue with this, and we talked about doing a documentary, and it came together because I was doing a documentary called Best Kept Secret that I directed last year, and the investors for that basically connected us with some people like Wes Christian, and others who basically helped to get the financing in place. So once you have the money and you have a vision, we worked on telling this story with access to some great people, as you see in the documentary, like Nomi Prinz and Danielle DiMartino Booth and Ron Paul and Max Kaiser and so many more.
Yeah, I noticed there's a lot of financial experts in the interview or in the documentary. A lot of interviews with them, and I was just curious. It looked as if most of the interviews were conducted virtually. So, was there any hiccups when it came to this, seeing as it's kind of a non-traditional way of filming, and I assume probably came about due to COVID?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, I think we realize from 2020 with the lockdowns how much work can be done virtually, and this conversation obviously is amongst them. So it actually it behooves the storytelling process to just sometimes not have to in this case we didn't have the money to even necessarily to travel to locations and do in person with camera setups and lighting and everything involved. So people I think have become more accustomed to seeing things through Zoom cameras. A lot of news interviews are done through Zoom now, so I think people have become more accustomed to seeing that. So overall it felt like it didn't take away, it didn't detract from the nature of the story that we were trying to tell, because again this is more it's very information loaded, as you know. It's not like if this was a personal, there's different ways of telling a documentary. As you know, there's ways that you could take it more personally and have someone particular insider maybe like giving their perspective, in which case you'd want to have the camera with that person going through their life, their journey. This is not as much a personal insider's take. This is more of a big picture perspective of the fraud and corruption, and really focusing a lot on the 2008 collapse and the bailouts of as we knew from we saw we saw movies like The Big Short, and Inside Job was a good documentary done at that time, but we wanted to remind the audience of just really how corrupt that whole bailout process was. I think this was an important aspect of this documentary.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's definitely information loaded, and it had a very journalistic feel to it. And I think you guys did a really good job of like summarizing down that information pretty well. But was there any one specific thing that you discovered while filming, or like tidbit of information that you got that was just kind of shocking to you that you didn't realize before?
Trying to think. I mean, to be honest, nothing really shocks me when it comes to the to the nature of finance and fraud. They really focused on naked short selling in the very
Hmm.
early part of it, and you can just people will see like in the first 20 minutes just how corrupt these practices are, how much of an inside game it is. I think the things that come out, that have come out more recently with Congress people and other government insiders basically just sort of assuming that it's normal for them to be able to trade and not see potential conflicts of interest, when it comes to policy and law. And I mean, I think that's really more shocking in a way, just how blasé our government officials are to not see that there's a conflict of interest when you're setting policies and influencing laws, right, as Congress, but then trading at the same time in stocks and companies that are going to benefit from those laws. I mean, not only do we know the corruption when it comes to companies financing, politicians, but actually, like, again, politicians then trading and making deals and whatnot. There's that seems to be off. It's like you shouldn't be able to set laws and then make money off, based on laws that you're setting. Just, it's crazy. So that's the kind of stuff that we didn't even get into because we put it out before some of these later, more recent, hearings and conversations and whatnot. So I think we didn't even get into how deep. I mean, honestly, it's like this is a good introductory level to the corruption of Wall Street insiders and politicians. I think there's a whole much deeper, darker level that we could go to, and that'd be quite an interesting dive.
Yeah, another aspect I thought was really interesting was you kind of there is a bit that goes off into the whole thing with GameStop and Wall Street bets and everything that happened there last year. Um, but I'm just curious, like when the initial pitch came for this project and when you started working on it, like what was the timeline of events? Like had Wall Street bets happened yet? Or was
Yeah.
it unfolding as you were making it?
Yeah, no, that was actually that had just happened, and so as I said, mentioned that Peter and I had talked about doing something about sort of the corruption on Wall Street. We had talked about that years ago, and then when this came about, it was really right after the Wall Street bets, the AMC stock, and the whole the whole Reddit crowd and all this.
Hmm.
So because of that, our the people involved in producing and financing really wanted to focus a bit on the naked short selling, right? That was a major issue. That naked short selling. It's like, I mean, like Wes Christian, I think explains it the best. It's like that's like Xeroxing the title for a car and selling it, to 1,000 people, but there's only one car.
Right.
That's kind of the analogy of this naked short selling thing, right? It's just like he says, like it's counterfeiting and it's fraud, and but again, it's like if you're inside, or if you're studying finance, and not just studying it but like living it, right, if you're actually like
Hmm.
paying attention to this stuff, I think it becomes very mundane, whereas when you actually explain it to people who are outside of it, they're like they are shocked by it. So I hope more people can see the documentary to realize just how corrupt this thing is.
Yeah, I definitely recommend it because I don't follow finance all that much. I mean, obviously it was kind of hard to avoid everything that happened with AMC stock and GameStop last year. Like it was unavoidable. And I found a lot of people did get more interested into it, but this documentary definitely gave more of an understanding of like, all right, what are all these terms? Because there's so much jargon thrown around. And I will
It's
say
like
that was one thing I also like.
economics.
You guys did a good job of defining, and you would have your narration over it of defining, okay, what is this term? But another thing I wanted to get to was you use it a lot of archival footage. And so where did the decision to do this come in? Is it just necessary to tell the story?
It is necessary, and I think, again, I mentioned earlier we wanted to go back to 2008 because that was such a major transfer of wealth. I mean, really, 2020 probably is a greater transfer of wealth in terms of, now we're at that place where 1% of the economy has, the top 1% has more wealthy than the entire middle class of America put together, which is just astounding. But the previous to this, the greatest transfer of wealth was 2008, with the homeowners really losing the value of their homes, and a lot of people losing homes, and losing basically, they said on average it was about like people lost about a third of their wealth in that time period. It was a very devastating time, and I came out of college pretty much just a couple of years before this whole meltdown. So it was difficult, just coming into the job market at the time, and coming in, just everything seemed in real crisis and fear. So we wanted to go back to that time period just to remind people of the corruption and collusion between, because that really was collusion in a sense of how the government chose to bail out AIG or in Goldman Sachs, right? And let, Lehman sort of be the sacrificial lamb and let a lot of homeowners suffer, um, while, while the boys that caused it, essentially, um, were bailed out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a major theme throughout the entire film. Um,
Absolutely.
but one last question. I'm going to end on a lighter note because we're running out of time. But obviously, you're Oliver Stone's son, and how does growing up with such an influential filmmaker impact your approach to cinema and to film and to documentary making and just your creative process?
Honestly, it's hard to explain because film has just sort of been part of my reality since I was born. So I'm probably, how do you say, I'm probably informed by a lot more cinema than most people are, right? In cinema history, in terms of just watching, watching old movies, having in a sense been like given an entree to, almost like a crash course in film history, right? Since I'm born, and being exposed to a lot of different influences. So it's difficult to say how he has it. I worked with him at one point. I did a documentary called Fight Against Time about Oliver Stone's Alexander. Basically, when he was making Alexander, it was the documentary of his making of process. And then I edited on W and his Untold History series. Worked as an editor, so I wasn't the only one, but I was working with him at that time. So I've had a chance to really work with him to see how his mind works, to understand it, to understand it to a certain extent. But ultimately, it really is each individual's creative life that has to come through in the storytelling process. And so that's why, I don't currently not working with my father, because it's like I have my own vision and my own sense of, storytelling, and everyone has to find that. So that's why it's difficult to answer that kind of question, because ultimately it's like you can learn from certain sources, you can be, coached in many ways, you can be, you can absorb things, but ultimately you have to find your own sense of voice and truth.
It's very poetic. um, yeah, so I don't really have any more questions at the current moment. But it was a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed the film. I suggest everyone out there go watch it because it's quite intriguing. And if you don't really follow finance, it's a little bit shocking to discover all this stuff. So thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you.